The groaning started 3 weeks before anyone thought to be afraid of it. It came from deep inside the station's ribs, a low sound like a door being pushed slowly against its hinges, and it traveled through the decks at night when the work lamps dimmed and the corridors went quiet. Mara Voss felt it more than she heard it. She would be lying in her bunk, counting down the days left on her contract, and the sound would roll through the metal under her back like something enormous turning over in its sleep. Then it would stop, and the station would be still again, and in the morning nobody mentioned it, because on Halvorn Reach you learned not to mention things that might cost you your shift. Mara had 412 days left on her contract. She kept the number in a small notebook, the old paper kind, because notebooks could not be audited by the company the way her wrist unit could. 412 days, and then a shuttle home, and then a life that belonged to her again. She had come out here at 22 with a debt from her mother's medical bills and a belief, mostly gone now, that hard work was its own kind of proof. She was 26 now. The belief had worn thin, but the discipline it left behind had not. Halvorn Reach hung in permanent orbit around a gas giant the color of a bruise, a ring-shaped refinery station built to strip volatile gases from the planet's upper atmosphere and process them into fuel stock for a dozen trade lanes. It was old. Sections of it had been built and rebuilt across 4 different corporate leases, which meant the station was less a single structure than a scar tissue of structures, welded and re-welded onto a spine that had never been designed to carry this much weight for this long. 6,000 workers lived and labored along that spine. Most of them were not human. The Ithran ran the place. They were the administrators, the license holders, the ones whose names appeared on the contracts that brought in labor from a dozen worlds. They were tall and narrow, built for low gravity, with long necks that curved forward when they walked and pale, feathered ridges along their jaws that flashed color when they were pleased or angry. They did not love or hate the workers under their authority. They accounted for them, the way a ledger accounts for weight and volume, and mostly that was fine, because a ledger does not go out of its way to hurt you either. Director Thessery ran the human contract block, among others. She had held the post for 11 years, which by Ithran standards was a modest span of a long life, and she had opinions about the species under her management that she did not trouble to hide. Humans, she had said once, in Mara's hearing, were efficient enough for short, repetitive labor, provided you accepted that their bodies failed early and their tempers ran hot. She meant it as a kind of professional observation, not cruelty. She had simply never seen a reason to think otherwise. On the morning the groaning began its 3rd week, Mara was down in processing Ring 4 with her crew, running valve inspections on a coolant line that fed the station's primary reactor core. It was slow work. You walked the line with a scanner, you logged the pressure readings, you flagged anything outside tolerance, and you did this for 10 hours because a station this old needed constant watching or it would quietly kill you. Mara didn't mind it. There was a kind of peace in work you could actually finish, one valve at a time, that she had never found anywhere else. Her crew lead was a Kethran named Kellen, a squat, 4-armed laborer from a heavy gravity world, who talked constantly and complained about everything and had, over 2 years of shared shifts, become the closest thing Mara had to a friend on the station. The Kethran were contract labor too, lower in the station's informal hierarchy than the Ithran but not quite as low as the humans, who were newest to Halvorn Reach and smallest in number. There was friction between the two groups sometimes, old resentments about shift assignments and ration allocations that the company did nothing to smooth over. Mara had decided early on that she didn't have the energy for it. "You hear it again last night?" Kellen asked, not looking up from the panel he was resealing. "Hard to miss," Mara said. "Maintenance says it's thermal cycling. Says the outer ring contracts when the shift lamps go down. It's been doing it for years. It's nothing." "You believe that?" Kellen's lower set of hands went still on the panel, which was the closest he came to a shrug. "I believe maintenance doesn't want to file a structural report 6 months before their contract renews. I don't believe it's nothing. I just don't know what it is." Mara logged the last valve reading and moved the scanner along to the next junction, and that was when the alarm on her wrist unit gave a short, unfamiliar chirp, a tone she hadn't heard before in 2 years on the Reach. She looked down. A pressure differential warning had flagged in an adjacent maintenance shaft, small, a fraction over tolerance, the kind of thing that usually meant a worn gasket and an hour of paperwork. She almost let it go. It was outside her assigned section, and picking up someone else's flag meant picking up someone else's blame if it turned out to be nothing. Instead, she walked the 15 meters to the shaft hatch and pulled it open, because the sound from the night before was still sitting somewhere at the back of her mind, and because ignoring small warnings had never once, in her experience, made them smaller. Inside the shaft, A junior technician named Pete was standing very still with his back against the wall, staring at a seal along the shaft's outer wall that had begun, very faintly, to hiss. "It wasn't doing that 10 minutes ago," Pete said. His voice had gone thin. Mara looked at the seal. A pressure hairline, not a breach, not yet, but the kind of thing that could become one if nobody acted before the shift ended. She keyed her unit to flag it as urgent, called it into maintenance by name and location, and then knelt down beside Pete and started talking him through the emergency clamp procedure step by step, the way the manual laid it out, because a shaking voice reading numbers off a checklist was better than a calm voice with nothing useful to say. By the time maintenance arrived 12 minutes later, the clamp was already seated and the hiss had stopped. The senior tech who came through the hatch looked at the clamp, looked at Mara, and said nothing beyond a curt nod, because on Halvorn Reach that was the closest thing to thanks a human laborer could expect. Mara didn't need the thanks. She logged the incident, walked back to her line, and picked up her scanner where she'd left it. She didn't know it yet, but somewhere 3 decks up, in an office with a wide viewport looking out over the gas giant storm bands, Director Thessery had pulled the incident report onto her screen out of idle habit, read 6 lines of it, and set it aside without much thought. It was the first small crack. Neither of them understood yet how wide it would open. That evening, walking back toward the residential block after her shift, Mara passed through the observation gallery that ran along the station's outer hull, a narrow corridor of reinforced viewports that most workers used only as a shortcut and rarely as a place to actually stop and look. She stopped anyway. Outside, the gas giant filled half the sky, its storm bands the color of an old bruise healing, and far below, threads of lightning traced silent paths through clouds taller than any mountain she'd ever stood on back home. She had grown up in a coastal town with real weather, real rain that fell instead of being pumped through recyclers, and some nights the sheer size of the view outside the station's hull was the only thing that reminded her she was still, in some fundamental sense, a creature meant to live under an open sky rather than inside a welded ring of metal. A Kethran engineer she didn't recognize was standing further down the gallery, both lower hands pressed flat against the viewport glass, watching the storms with an intensity that made Mara wonder, not for the first time, whether homesickness looked the same across every species that ended up out here on a contract they couldn't afford to break. She didn't approach. Some quiet was better left alone. She thought, walking the rest of the way to the mess hall, about the 412 days left on her contract, and about how strange it was that a number meant to measure freedom could also feel, some nights, like the only solid thing holding her in place. Director Thessery's office was the quietest room on Halvorn Reach, which was one of the reasons she liked it. 6,000 contract workers generated a great deal of noise, most of it complaint, and she had long ago decided that her time was better spent managing the station's numbers than absorbing its moods. She stood at the viewport now, watching lightning crawl silently through the gas giant's upper bands, a slow violet flicker that never seemed to end, and she thought, as she often did at this hour, that the view was the only part of this posting she would genuinely miss. Her aide, a younger Ithran named Corval, entered with a data slate held against his chest. The Ring 4 Incident Report. Director. Human tech flagged and contained a pressure seal before it reached breach threshold. "I saw it," Thessery said. "Log it, close it." Maintenance wants to note that response time was faster than protocol required. The tech didn't wait for a senior call. Thessery turned from the window. Initiative or impatience? Corval. With that species it's often difficult to tell the difference. She did not say it unkindly. It was, to her mind, simply an observation built from 11 years of data. Humans work hard and burned out fast. They organized themselves into small, tight groups and defended those groups fiercely, sometimes past the point of sense. They had short lives even by the standards of short-lived species, a fact that colored, she believed, everything else about them. Their hurry, their intensity, the way they seemed to treat every shift like it might be their last, because for a human, in a very literal sense, it might be. She did not resent them for it. She simply priced it into her expectations, the way she priced in the corrosive atmosphere outside the hull or the age of the station's coolant lines. A known variable, accounted for, filed away. What she had not priced in, because it had never occurred to her to look for it, was what 6,000 short, hurried lives might be capable of when all of them ran out of patience for panic at the same time. 3 decks below, in the residential block the humans had claimed as their own, Mara sat with Kellen and a dozen others over the evening meal, a thin stew that tasted mostly of the recycled water it was made with. The mess hall the humans used was small, a converted cargo bay with long tables bolted to the deck, decorated over the years with things people had made from scrap, a mural along one wall depicting a green hillside none of the newer arrivals had ever seen with their own eyes, painted by someone who had rotated home 4 contracts ago and left it behind. Maintenance filed the shaft seal as a training exercise, Kellen said, working through his own bowl with 2 of his 4 hands while the other 2 sorted a small mechanical part on the table in front of him. Training exercise. You want to know what that means? It means nobody has to explain why the seal was already close to failing, Mara said. It means nobody has to explain why the seal was already close to failing, Kellen agreed. You know how many seals like that are in this station? I've walked this ring for 6 years. I know where the old worlds are. I know where the new worlds are laid over the old worlds because nobody wanted to strip the plating down to do it right. This place is held together with patience and grease. So what do we do about it? Kellen set down his spoon. We do what we always do. We log it. We flag it. We hope somebody with more authority than us decides it's worth the credits to fix before it decides for them. Mara didn't answer right away. Around them, the mess hall carried on its low evening noise, laughter from a table near the mural, someone's music playing quietly from a personal unit, the ordinary sound of people getting through another day of a life none of them had chosen for its own sake. She thought about the sound in the night, the slow turning over groan that traveled through the deck plates, and she thought about how easily everyone around her had learned to fold that fear into the shape of an ordinary evening and keep eating. She had noticed something else, too, in the 2 years she'd spent on the Reach, something she had never quite put into words until that night. When something went wrong in the human block, the block organized. Fast, and without much discussion. A leak got flagged and 3 people showed up to help before anyone was asked. A worker collapsed on shift, and someone always seemed to already know where the medical kit was kept. It wasn't heroism, exactly. It was closer to reflex, something worn into the group the way water was a channel into stone, built from 1,000 small emergencies going back generations, long before any of them had ever set foot on a station like this one. The Kethrin had their own version of it, looser, built around clan loyalty rather than proximity, which was part of why the 2 groups sometimes rubbed wrong against each other, different instincts about who counted as one of your own when things went bad. Kellen, Mara said. If something bigger happened here. Not a seal. Something real. Would your people and mine work together, or would we end up fighting over the evacuation pods? Kellen was quiet for a moment, which for him was unusual. Honest answer. I don't know. We've never needed to find out. Maybe we should, Mara said, before we need to find out the hard way. It was a small conversation, the kind that happens over a bad dinner and gets forgotten by morning in most lives. Mara didn't forget it. Over the following days, without making anything official of it, she began doing small things, sharing the human block's emergency checklist with Kellen's crew, learning the Kethrin distress signal patterns in return, making sure that when the 2 group shifts overlapped, at least a few people on each side knew the other's names. It cost her almost nothing. She did not expect it to matter. She had no way of knowing that the groaning in the station spine was not thermal cycling, and had never been thermal cycling, and that 4 decks up, inside the aging heart of the primary reactor housing, a support strut that had been failing by fractions of a millimeter for 11 years was 3 weeks away from failing by all of them at once. Kellen's first attempt to formalize the human Kethrin checklist exchange did not go entirely smoothly. A Kethrin crew lead from a different work gang, an older laborer named Osik who held some seniority among the Kethrin contract workers, pulled Kellen aside 2 days later and asked, not unkindly but not gently either, why he was spending his rest hours teaching distress signals to a species that had only been on the Reach a fraction as long as the Kethrin had, and who, Osik did not say this part directly, but the implication sat plainly underneath his words, had never proven themselves worth the effort in the way older, more established work gangs had. Kellen didn't have a clever answer ready. He thought about it for a moment and then said, simply, that he'd worked beside Mara Voss for 2 years, that she had never once let a flag problem sit unaddressed out of convenience, and that he trusted his own 2 years of direct observation more than he trusted a general reputation built out of second-hand grumbling in the mess hall. Osik didn't seem entirely convinced, but he didn't forbid it either, and among the Kethrin, that was often as close to approval as a new idea was likely to get on the first attempt. It was a small friction, barely worth mentioning at the time, and it resolved itself the way most small frictions on Halvorn Reach did, not through any grand reconciliation, but through the slow, unglamorous accumulation of shared shifts and small favors traded back and forth until the 2 groups simply stopped keeping such careful count of who owed what to whom. Halvorn Reach was built the way most old stations were built, which is to say it was built in pieces, by different companies, under different regulations, at different points in its long working life. At its center sat the primary reactor, an aging fusion core that had been refitted twice but never fully replaced, because a full replacement meant shutting down the refinery for a year, and no leaseholder in the station's history had been willing to eat that cost. Around the reactor ran 4 concentric rings, connected by 12 support spines, and it was in those spines that the station's real age showed. The outer plating was new where inspectors could see it. The load-bearing structure underneath was original. None of the workers on Halvorn Reach knew the full engineering picture, because no single department was given all of it. Maintenance saw the surface reports. Structural saw the stress logs, when anyone bothered to run them. The Ithran administration saw the budget, and the budget, for 11 years running, had found reasons to defer the one repair that mattered most, a full replacement of the number 6 support spine, the one that ran directly beneath the Human and Kethran residential blocks, the one that had been groaning in the dark for 3 weeks. Director Thessery did not know this either, not really. She knew the budget line existed. She had signed off on deferring it 4 times, each time on the recommendation of an engineering report that told her what she wanted to hear, because the alternative was a lease renegotiation that would have looked very bad on her record. This was not unusual. It was, in fact, exactly how most disasters of this kind begin, not with a single bad decision, but with a long chain of small, reasonable ones, each made by someone who never saw the whole shape of what they were building toward. Mara learned a piece of this by accident, the way most people learn the truth about the places they work. She had been reassigned for a week to help with an inventory audit in the structural archive, a windowless room 3 decks below processing ring 4 where old maintenance logs were kept in case a lease dispute ever required them. It was tedious work, cross-referencing paper manifests against digital records, and on her 3rd day she found a stress report from 11 years earlier, filed under a department code she didn't recognize, recommending an urgent replacement of Spine 6 within 18 months to avoid what the report called, in flat technical language, catastrophic structural fatigue. The report had a rejection stamp on it. Budget deferred. Next review in 5 years. Beneath it, for more identical reports, for more identical stamps, spaced out across the following decade like a slow countdown nobody had been reading. Mara sat with the report for a long time before she brought it to anyone. She showed it first to Kellen, because he was the one person on the station she trusted not to either panic or dismiss it outright. He read it twice, his jaw tightening with each pass, and then he said the thing Mara had already been thinking. This isn't a maintenance problem. This is the whole spine. If this goes, it doesn't just crack a seal. It takes the ring down with it. Which ring? Ours. They took it to the shift supervisor next, a mid-level Ithran named Ovet who had always struck Mara as more decent than most, and Ovet, to his credit, did not dismiss them. He filed it up the chain that same day, flagged urgent, with Mara's name attached as the one who had found it. It took 4 days for a response to come back down. The response was not what Mara had hoped for. Director Thessery's office acknowledged the report, noted that a full structural survey would be scheduled for the following fiscal cycle, and reminded all departments that unauthorized access to archive structural records was a contract violation, subject to review. Mara was called into a small administrative office the next morning, not Thessery's, but one of her deputies, and informed, without any particular hostility, that her audit reassignment was ending early and she would be returning to her regular line duties. Nothing else was said about the report. No survey date was given. The matter was, as far as the station's official record was concerned, closed. She walked out of that office angrier than she had been in 2 years, and it took her most of the day to understand that the anger wasn't really about herself. She had 400 days left on her contract. She could keep her head down, finish her line duties, and go home, and the spine would be someone else's problem, the way it had been someone else's problem for 11 years running. That was the easy version of the next 400 days, and some tired, practical part of her wanted it. Instead, that evening, she went to the mess hall and found Kellen, and the two of them began, quietly, without any authority to do it and without telling anyone above them, drawing up an evacuation plan of their own, not because they believed the station's leadership would refuse to act if the worst happened, but because Mara had learned, over 400 archive days, exactly how long it took that leadership to act on anything at all. It was a small, private decision, made across a folding table with a cargo bay mural of a green hillside looking down on them. Neither of them called it anything important. It was simply the kind of thing you did when you noticed a door with no working lock and decided, quietly, to keep a chair nearby, just in case. Kellen brought 2 more Kethrin crew leads into the plan over the following days, on his own judgment, without asking Mara first. Mara found out and, instead of being angry about the overreach, was glad of it. That was the moment, though she wouldn't recognize it as such until much later, that the plan stopped being a human plan or a Kethrin plan and became something else, a shared thing, built out of trust extended before it was strictly earned, the kind of trust that costs nothing to offer and everything to withhold when the moment finally comes that tests it. The groaning in the station spine continued through all of this, night after night, patient and unhurried, counting down toward a moment none of them could yet name. One of the 2 Kethrin crew leads Kellen had brought in, a soft-spoken engineer named Ossa, asked Mara directly, during one of their late planning sessions, why she was doing this at all, given that she had every reason to simply keep her head down and let the remaining days on her contract pass quietly. Mara thought about the question longer than she expected to. Where I grew up, she said finally, there were storms that came in off the water a few times a year. Bad ones. The kind that took roofs off houses and knocked out power for a week at a time. Nobody official ever showed up in time to help. The town was too small, too far from anywhere that mattered to anyone with real resources. So people just did it themselves. My grandmother used to say a storm doesn't care whose job it was supposed to be. It just comes, and afterward, the only households that were still standing warm were the ones who'd already decided, long before the storm arrived, who they were going to check on first. She shrugged. I think that's just how we are built. Not better than anyone else. Just built that way. The same way your people are built for clan loyalty and heavy gravity. It's not a virtue. It's just a habit that happens to be useful when everything falls apart at once. Ossa considered this for a while, turning it over the way she turned over problems in the machine shop, methodically, from every angle. Kethrin clans work the same way, more or less, she said eventually. We just draw the circle differently. Blood and contract kin, mostly. Not proximity. Maybe the circle's the only thing that matters, Mara said. Doesn't much matter how you draw it, as long as you draw it before the storm shows up instead of after. It wasn't a conversation either of them thought much about again in the weeks that followed. But it was, in its quiet way, the moment the plan stopped being 2 separate contingencies running in parallel and became, instead, a single circle drawn wide enough to hold all of them. Director Thessery had not forgotten the report. She wanted to be clear with herself about that, in the private accounting she kept in her own mind, the one no audit would ever see. She had not forgotten it. She had simply weighed it against 40 other urgent items on a budget that could not fund all of them, and the spine had lost that argument the way it had lost it 4 times before, because a groaning noise in the night was not, in her long experience, the same thing as a crisis. She had been an administrator on 3 different stations across 30 years of Ithran service. She had heard structures groan before. She had read 100 technical warnings that turned out to describe problems with margins still built into them, and she had learned, the way any long-serving administrator learns, that acting on every warning was its own kind of failure, a slow bleed of resources spent on fears that never came due. Caution and paranoia were not the same thing, and it was her job to know the difference. What she did not have, and had no way of getting, was a full picture of Spine 6's actual condition, because the survey that would have given her that picture had been deferred 4 times, each deferral making the eventual survey more urgent and less likely to happen, in the particular way that neglected problems tend to compound themselves. She scheduled the survey for the next fiscal cycle, 6 months out. She believed, honestly, that 6 months was a reasonable margin. Spine 6 did not believe the same thing. 11 days after Mara's audit reassignment ended, a minor tremor ran through processing Ring 4 during the middle shift, brief enough that most workers mistook it for a docking vibration from an incoming supply freighter. Mara felt it differently. She was standing at a coolant junction when it came through the deck plates, not a groan this time but a sharp, single jolt, gone in under a second, and in the silence that followed she found she was holding her breath without having decided to. She logged it immediately, flagged it urgent, and copied the flag to Kellen and to Yvette, the shift supervisor who had helped her before. Within the hour, a maintenance team had swept the section and found nothing conclusive. No visible damage, no pressure anomaly, nothing that met the threshold for an emergency structural response. The tremor was noted, filed, and set aside, one more entry in a log that had been quietly accumulating small, unexplained entries for over a decade. That night, Mara couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk listening for the groan, and when it came, later than usual, it sounded different to her, though she couldn't have said exactly how. Lower, maybe, or longer, or simply more present in a way that had nothing to do with the actual physics of sound and everything to do with how frightened she had become of hearing it. She got up before her shift and went to find Kellen, who was already awake, sitting outside the human block's mess hall with two of the Kethren crew leads he'd recruited into their private evacuation plan. They had been talking, it turned out, for most of the night. "We think it's close," Kellen said, without preamble, when Mara sat down. "Not months close. Weeks. Maybe less." "Based on what?" "We are not structural engineers." "Based on the fact that the tremor yesterday came from directly above the human block, and the groan every night is loudest in the same place, and both of those things line up with where that 11-year-old report said the failure would start." Kellen spread his upper hands, palms up, an old Kethren gesture Mara had learned meant something close to "I have nothing left to offer but this. I don't need to be an engineer to see three dots and draw the line between them." Mara thought of Director Thessary's response to the report, the reminder about unauthorized access, the survey scheduled 6 months out, the door quietly closing on the one warning that might have mattered. She thought about how easy it would be to bring this new information forward and watch it disappear into the same slow machinery. "We are not going to convince them faster than the spine is going to fail," she said finally. "So we stop trying to convince them. We finish the plan. Quietly. All of it, evacuation routes, muster points, who checks on who. And we make sure it isn't just us and your crew leads who know it. We need more hands, from every block, human and Kethren both, and we need them ready before this happens, not after." "That's a lot of people to bring in without official backing," one of the Kethren crew leads said, a wiry laborer named Dessa who had said little until now. "If administration finds out we are running an unauthorized evacuation drill, that's a contract violation. Could cost all of us our positions." "It could," Mara agreed. "Or it could be the only reason some of us are still breathing in a month." Nobody argued with her after that. Over the following 2 weeks, without any authorization and without any acknowledgement from the station's official structure, the plan grew. It grew carefully, block by block, one trusted name at a time, because a plan too loudly shared was a plan that would draw the attention of an administration inclined to shut it down for the crime of embarrassing them. Mara mapped every evacuation route in the human and Kethren residential blocks by hand, walking each one herself after her shifts ended, timing the routes, noting where corridors narrowed into bottlenecks, where emergency hatches had been sealed shut by years of accumulated cargo nobody had ever cleared. She did not know, could not have known, that she was building, quietly, without credit or authority, out of nothing but stubbornness and a notebook full of numbers, the only functioning emergency response the station would have when Spine 6 finally gave way. The groaning continued, night after night, and now Mara understood, with a certainty that sat cold in her chest, that it was not counting down towards some distant fiscal cycle. It was counting down towards something much closer than that, and it was not going to wait for anyone's permission to arrive. Mara spent one of her rest days that week doing something she hadn't done since her first month on the station. She wrote an actual letter, the kind that had to be transmitted through the station's slow civilian relay rather than typed into a private message, addressed to her mother back on the coast. She kept it short. She wrote about the work, mostly, and about Kellen's endless arguments with anyone who'd listen, and about a mural of a hillside that reminded her, some nights, of the view from her grandmother's porch. She did not mention the groaning in the deck plates, or the 11-year-old report sitting in an archive nobody wanted her in, or the quiet plans she and Kellen and a handful of others were building without any authorization at all. There didn't seem to be a way to explain any of it that wouldn't cause more worry than it was worth. 300 light-years and a 2-week transmission delay away from anyone who could do anything about it. She sealed the letter and sent it, and then she went back to walking evacuation routes after her shifts, timing corridors, marking bottlenecks, because whatever she couldn't say to her mother, she could still do something about here, in the only place any of it would actually matter. Spine 6 failed on an ordinary Tuesday, 40 minutes into the middle shift, while most of the station's population was either at work or asleep and utterly unprepared for what the deck plates were about to do beneath them. It did not fail all at once. It failed the way old, overstressed structures usually fail, a cascade, one weakened joint transferring its load to the next weakened joint, each one carrying a little more than it was ever built to hold, until the whole chain gave way within the span of about 90 seconds. The first sign was a groan louder than any that had come before it, a deep structural cry that every worker on the residential decks felt in their teeth before they heard it in their ears. Then the lights along the number 6 corridor flickered and dropped to emergency red, and a pressure klaxon began sounding through the human and Kethren blocks at a volume that left no room for anyone to mistake it for a drill. Mara was off shift, 3 decks up, helping Pete, the junior tech she'd talked through the seal clamp weeks earlier, repair a personal unit in the mess hall when the klaxon hit. She was on her feet before the second tone finished sounding. "Muster points," she said to Pete, already moving. "You know your route." Pete nodded, wide-eyed, and Mara didn't wait to see him go. She had walked this exact scenario in her head a dozen times over the past 2 weeks, and her body moved through it now with a calm that surprised even her, because calm, she had learned, was not the absence of fear. It was fear with somewhere useful to put itself. The actual failure, when it came, was worse than the plan had accounted for. Spine 6 did not simply crack, it sheared, a full structural collapse along nearly 40 meters of the station's central support, and the ring sections on either side of the break began, slowly and with a groan that Mara would hear in her memory for the rest of her life, to separate. Atmosphere howled out through the widening gap. Emergency bulkheads slammed down along a dozen corridors at once, some of them sealing people into rooms, others sealing people out of the only routes they knew to safety, because the bulkhead system had been designed decades earlier for isolated breaches, not for a structural failure that opened wounds in 6 places simultaneously. Within the first 4 minutes, the human and Catherine residential blocks lost primary power. Backup lighting held, dim and red, throwing long shadows down corridors already thick with smoke from a shorted junction box near the mess hall. Somewhere below, a scream cut off sharply and did not resume, and Mara made herself keep moving instead of finding out why, because there was nothing she could do about what was already finished and a great deal she might still do about what wasn't. By the time she reached the first muster point, an intersection 3 corridors from the mess hall, chosen weeks earlier specifically because it sat between 2 bulkhead lines and would likely stay accessible from both directions, a crowd had already begun to gather, and it was not an orderly one. Humans and Catherine both, mixed in with a scattering of other station workers who had simply run toward the nearest open space, pressed against each other in the red half-light, shouting over one another, a dozen voices demanding to know where the evacuation pods were, whether the whole ring was going to depressurize, whether anyone in administration even knew what was happening. This was the moment, though Mara didn't think of it in these terms at the time, that the 2 weeks of quiet, unauthorized preparation either mattered or didn't. She climbed onto an overturned equipment crate so the crowd could see her, and she did not shout. She had learned, from a dozen small emergencies over the years, that shouting into a panicking crowd only fed the panic. Instead she pitched her voice to carry, flat and steady, the same voice she'd used to talk Pete through a hairline seal 3 weeks before. "Everyone from the human block, muster point 2 is this way, 2nd corridor left, it's clear as of 90 seconds ago." She pointed. "Catherine Cruz, Dessa has your route, she's 20 meters behind me, follow her voice, not mine. If you don't know your route, find someone standing still, they know theirs, and they'll take you with them. Nobody runs alone. Nobody gets left to find their own way. Move." It should not have worked. A single voice, with no authority behind it, in a corridor full of people who had every reason in the universe to trust nothing and no one in that moment. It should not have worked. But Kellen was already moving through the crowd from the other direction, physically turning people by the shoulder toward the correct corridor, and Dessa's voice picked up 30 meters back exactly where Mara's instruction said it would be, and the crowd, disorganized as it was, found something to hold onto that was more solid than its own fear, and it began, raggedly, to move. 3 decks above, in a command center lit by the same emergency red that had swallowed the residential blocks, Director Thessery stood before a bank of failing status displays and understood, for the first time in 11 years on Halvorn Reach, that she had let a warning sit 6 months too long, and that the 6 months had run out weeks before the calendar said they should. "Casualty and structural reports," she said to Corval, her voice tighter than she meant it to be. "Now." "Director, the human and Catherine residential blocks, command feeds are down in most of that section. We have no eyes there. We don't know what's happening." Thessery looked at the dead displays for a long moment. 6,000 workers under her authority, and in the section that mattered most right now, she had nothing. No information. No control. Nothing but the awful, sinking certainty that whatever was happening down there was happening entirely without her, and entirely because of a decision she had made. What Director Thessery could not see from her command center, because her feeds were dark and her authority, for the first time in her career, did not reach the place where it was needed most, was this. In the section of Halvorn Reach cut off from every official channel, something was happening that had no line item in any budget, no procedure in any manual, and no precedent in 11 years of Ithran administration. The muster points held. Not perfectly. Nothing about that night was perfect. But where Mara's crude, hand-drawn plan had marked a rally point, people found each other there, and where the plan had marked a route, people who knew the way pulled along people who didn't, and the ragged, panicked crowd that had gathered in the first minutes after the collapse resolved itself, corridor by corridor, into something that functioned. Kellen's Catherine crews, moving on instructions, passed hand to hand through a chain of people who trusted the ones next to them because Mara had spent 2 quiet weeks making sure they had reason to, cleared jammed emergency hatches that would otherwise have sealed entire sections into traps. Dessa organized a head count at each muster point using nothing but memorized crew rosters, calling names into the smoke and marking who answered, because in the failure of every automated system on the ring, a human being with a list and a working set of lungs turned out to be more reliable than anything electronic. It was not humans alone. Mara would have been the first to say so, later, and meant it. The Catherine crews held their sections with a discipline that matched anything the human block managed, and by the second hour, workers from 3 other contracted species, none of whom had been part of the original plan, had folded themselves into the nearest functioning muster group simply because it was the only structure left standing in a station that had otherwise come apart at the seams. But it was the plan itself, and the instinct that built it, that made the difference between a station in chaos and a station finding its footing in the dark. And that instinct, Mara would reflect much later, without ever saying it aloud to anyone who hadn't lived through the night, was one she recognized from every human crew she had ever worked beside. Not bravery exactly, and not discipline exactly either, but something more like a reflex worn smooth by generations of practice. When everything falls apart, you find the nearest people, you build a structure out of nothing, and you hold that structure together by main force of will until something better comes along to replace it. By the 3rd hour, 3 of the 6 breach corridors had been sealed by hand, using manual clamps salvaged from a supply locker Mara remembered from her audit week, patched into place by Pete and 2 Catherine engineers working in suits borrowed from a maintenance closet because the station's official emergency suits were locked in a section none of them could reach. Atmosphere stabilized enough in the surviving muster areas that people could remove their breathing masks and speak without gasping. It felt, for the first time since the klaxon sounded, almost like victory. It was not victory. It was the false kind, the kind that arrives exactly long enough to let everyone believe the worst has already happened, before the situation reveals that it has not. The reading came in on a scavenged pressure gauge that Kellen had rigged to a working display near the 3rd muster point. The reactor housing, 3 decks up from the collapsed spine, was drawing coolant unevenly through a feed line that had been partially severed in the initial failure. Left alone, the imbalance would correct itself or fail catastrophically within the hour, and there was no way, from where they stood, to know which. If it fails, Kellen said quietly, reading the numbers over Mara's shoulder, it doesn't just take the reactor housing. It's close enough to what's left of Spine 6 that it takes the whole central structure with it. Every muster point we've built. All of it. Mara stared at the gauge for a long moment, doing the math the way she'd learned to do it over 400 archived days spent finding one report nobody had wanted her to find. There was a manual coolant bypass, she knew, somewhere in the reactor housing itself. She'd seen it referenced in the old structural logs, a physical valve system installed as a failsafe decades before the station's automated controls had ever been built. It would have to be operated by hand, from inside a section that was almost certainly still venting atmosphere, by someone willing to go in without knowing for certain they'd come back out. She looked at the corridor leading up toward the reactor housing, dark and unmapped by anyone's plan, and understood that the version of this night where everyone simply survived because a plan had held together was already over. Around her, the muster point had settled into a strange, fragile rhythm of its own. Someone had found a working light panel and rigged it above the head count table, and beneath its pale glow, Dessa worked through her rosters with 2 other Catherine calling out names in a steady rotation, marking each answer with a stub of grease pencil because every digital slate in the section had gone dark hours ago. A young human woman Mara didn't know by name was moving between small groups of frightened workers with a water canister and a voice pitched low and even, not offering false comfort, just presence, just the simple fact of another person choosing to stay close instead of curling into their own fear. An Ithran maintenance tech, cut off from his own department by a bulkhead none of them could reopen, had folded himself into the group without being asked, running diagnostics on a scavenged air scrubber because it was the only useful thing left for his hands to do. Nobody had told any of them to do this. Nobody with any authority had told them anything at all in 3 hours. They had simply looked at the wreckage of the night and decided, each in their own way, that doing something mattered more than waiting to be instructed, and that decision, repeated independently 100 times across a dozen separate huddles of frightened, exhausted workers, had become, without any of them quite noticing the moment it happened, a kind of order all its own. "I'm the one who knows where the bypass valve is," Mara said, before Kellen could offer to go in her place, because she had already seen the shape of that argument forming behind his eyes and she did not have time to lose it. I read the schematic. You'd be guessing. I won't be. You'd be guessing too, Mara. A schematic from an archive isn't the same as a corridor that's been torn open by a structural collapse. No, she agreed. But it's better than nothing, and nothing is what we have if we wait for someone qualified to show up. There's nobody coming. You know that better than anyone here. He did know it. That was the worst part. 3 hours into the collapse, with command feeds still dark and every official channel silent, it had become clear to everyone at the muster point that whatever help existed above them had not yet found a way to reach them, and might not find one before the reactor housing decided the question for all of them. Kellen found a suit that mostly fit her from the maintenance locker, checked the seals himself with all 4 hands moving at once, and said nothing else about going in her place, because he understood, in the end, that arguing with her would only cost time none of them had. Pete found her before she left. He was younger than her by only a few years, but in the red emergency light he looked much younger than that, and he pressed a small toolkit into her hands, the same kind she'd used to talk him through the seal clamp weeks earlier, and said, "You told me the checklist works if you don't skip steps." "It does," Mara said. "Don't skip steps." She didn't answer that except to grip his shoulder once, hard, and then she was moving, alone, up a dark and unmapped corridor toward a reactor housing that might already be venting the atmosphere she was breathing. The corridor was worse than the schematic had suggested. Twice she had to climb over buckled deck plating where the structural shift had torn the floor loose from its mounts, and once she had to wait, flattened against a wall, while a support beam groaned somewhere above her and settled with a shudder that rained loose debris down through a ceiling panel 6 meters ahead. Her suit's external gauge read atmosphere dropping steadily as she climbed, not a breach exactly, but a slow bleed from somewhere she couldn't see, the kind of leak that would eventually turn the whole corridor into vacuum if nothing stopped it. She found the reactor housing access hatch exactly where the archive schematic said it would be, sealed but not locked, because the design predated any of the digital locks the station's newer sections used. Inside, the manual bypass system sat behind a service panel coated in decades of undisturbed dust, a set of levers and gauges that looked, in the dim glow of her suit light, almost primitive next to the failed automated systems 1 deck below. She worked the checklist the way she had taught Pete to work it, step by step, out loud inside her own helmet because the sound of her own voice was the only steady thing left in that corridor. Isolate feed line 3. Confirm pressure differential. Engage manual bypass in sequence, never out of order, because out of order meant a coolant surge the housing wasn't built to absorb. The 3rd lever stuck. It should not have stuck. The schematic gave no indication that it would. But decades of dust and disuse had seized the mechanism just enough that when Mara pulled, nothing moved, and the gauge beside it kept climbing toward a threshold she understood, with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with panic, meant the housing would begin to fail within minutes if the sequence wasn't completed. She braced both boots against the housing wall, took hold of the lever with both hands, and pulled with everything her body had left to give, and for 3 long seconds nothing happened at all, and she thought, with a strange and distant calm, of the notebook in her bunk with 400 days crossed off in neat rows, and of a green hillside painted on a mess hall wall by someone who had made a home before her. The lever gave. Not smoothly. It tore loose with a shriek of metal that she felt through her boots more than heard, and the sequence completed, and somewhere in the housing's aging heart, coolant began flowing evenly again through a system that had come within minutes of failing catastrophically. Mara sat down hard on the deck plating, her suit alarm chiming softly to tell her what she already knew, that her air was running low, and that the corridor behind her was a long way to climb with what she had left. She allowed herself perhaps 30 seconds to simply sit there, back against the housing wall, watching the pressure gauge settle into a steady, even line for the first time since she'd entered the room. 30 seconds felt like an enormous luxury. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were shaking inside her suit gloves, a delayed reaction her body had apparently been saving up for the moment the actual work was finished. She let them shake. There was no checklist for that part. Through the thin static of her suit comm, she could hear fragments of chatter from the muster point below, Dessa's voice reading names off a roster, someone laughing at something she couldn't make out, the ordinary sound of people getting through a night none of them should have survived intact. It struck her, sitting alone in the reactor housing with her air running low, that she had spent 400 days on this station thinking of herself as someone simply passing through, marking time until a life that belonged to her could properly begin again. She understood now, with a clarity that came easily to people who have just done something they were fairly certain would kill them, that the life had already begun. It had begun weeks ago, over a folding table, with a friend who complained about everything and meant none of it, and a plan drawn on the back of a supply requisition form because nobody had thought to bring proper paper to a meeting that wasn't supposed to be a meeting at all. Her suit alarm shifted from chime to steady tone. She made herself stand, made herself check the corridor behind her for the debris that had nearly stopped her twice on the way up, and began, slowly, the climb back down toward the only people in the universe who currently knew exactly where to find her. Kellen had not stayed at the muster point after Mara left, no matter what he'd told her he would do. He had waited exactly long enough for her suit telemetry to confirm she'd reached the reactor housing, and then he had taken 2 of the Kethran engineers who'd helped seal the breached corridors earlier that night, and he had gone after her, following the same buckled, unmapped route, because he had decided, somewhere in the 3 hours since the collapse began, that the plan the 2 of them had built together did not end with one person going into the dark alone while everyone else waited, safely behind a sealed door. That had never been the arrangement, not really, not in the 2 weeks of quiet trust they'd spent building it, even if neither of them had ever said so out loud. He found her sitting against the reactor housing wall, suit alarm chiming, air reserves reading low enough that the number made something in his chest go cold. She was conscious, and she was, when he pulled her up onto her feet, already trying to explain the bypass sequence to him in case he needed to verify it, because even with her running out, some stubborn, checklist-driven part of her mind refused to stop working the problem. It held, she said. The bypass. It held. I know. We can see the pressure readings from the muster point. That's how we knew where to find you. Kellen got one arm under hers and nodded to the 2 engineers to take her other side. Save the rest of the report for someone who isn't currently running out of air, Voss. The climb back down was faster than the climb up, mostly because there were 4 of them instead of 1, and because Kellen half carried her over the sections of buckled plating that had cost her long minutes alone. Her suit alarm went from chime to steady tone 20 meters from the muster point, and it was Dessa, of all people, who met them at the hatch with a spare air canister from a Kethran engineering kit, seated it against Mara's suit with practiced hands, and said nothing at all about the debt that had just been repaid, because by that point in the night, nobody at that muster point was keeping score anymore. 3 decks up, Director Thessary's command center had finally re-established a thin data link to the affected section, patched together by a technical crew working from the undamaged side of the collapse for the better part of 3 hours. The feed that came through was partial and delayed, but it was enough to show her, for the first time since the klaxon sounded, a coherent picture of what had happened in the dark below her authority. She saw muster points that had held. She saw a head count, compiled by hand and relayed corridor to corridor, that accounted for all but 11 of the 6,000 workers in the affected blocks, a number that would have been catastrophically higher without the routes that someone, somehow, had mapped and rehearsed with no authorization at all. She saw a reactor housing that should, by every model her engineering staff could produce, have failed and taken the station's central structure with it, and had not failed, because a manual bypass system installed decades before her posting had been engaged, by hand, by someone who should have had no reason to know it existed. Who did this? She asked Corval, watching the partial feed with an expression her aide had never seen on her before. The muster points. The routes. Who organized this? Corval checked the fragmentary logs that had come through with the data link. The head counts are signed with a contract worker's identification. Human. Mara Voss. Thessary was quiet for a long moment, watching the feed, watching 6,000 lives that had, by every reasonable expectation of her 11 years of experience, been left to chaos and had instead, somehow, organized themselves into something that worked. At the muster point below, none of them yet knew they were being watched. Mara sat wrapped in a thermal blanket someone had produced from a supply crate, sipping water from Pete's canteen while Kellen argued cheerfully with Dessa over whether the bypass sequence would hold until proper repair crews could reach the housing, an argument neither of them had the engineering background to settle and both of them clearly enjoyed anyway, because after a night like that one, an ordinary disagreement felt almost like a gift. Around them, the muster point had begun, in its exhausted way, to feel less like an emergency shelter and more like something else. A room full of people from 4 different worlds who had spent 6 hours discovering they could trust each other with their lives, and had not yet figured out how to simply go back to being strangers again. You went in alone, Kellen said to her at one point, not for the first time that night, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't entirely worn off yet. You could have waited for me. There wasn't time to wait for anyone. There's always time to not go alone, Voss. That was the whole point of the last 2 weeks. He shook his head, all 4 hands gesturing at once in a way that Mara had learned, over 2 years, meant he was more frightened in retrospect than he'd let himself be in the moment. Next time, you drag me along before you decide to be a hero. There won't be a next time, Mara said. I intend to make very sure of that. You always say that. You never mean it. She didn't have an answer for that one, mostly because he wasn't wrong, and they both knew it, and neither of them needed to say anything else about it for the rest of that long, quiet night. The same worker who filed the structural report, she said. It wasn't a question. She remembered the name now, attached in her memory to a contract violation warning she had authorized without a second thought. Yes, Director. Thesry did not say anything else for a while. She simply watched the numbers on the feed, the 11 unaccounted for against the 5,989 who had made it to safety, and understood, with a particular clarity that comes only after a decision has already cost what it was going to cost, exactly how much her 11 years of careful, reasonable, well-precedented judgment had failed to see. It took 11 days to fully stabilize Halvorn Reach, to seal what could be sealed, to rebuild what had to be rebuilt, and to bury the 11 who had not made it to any muster point in time. Mara attended each of those services, standing at the back of a crowd that had, in the space of one long night, stopped sorting itself quite so neatly by species and contract tier, and found that she did not have the energy left to feel triumphant about anything. Director Thesry sent for her on the 12th day. Mara went to the office with the wide viewport, the same one she had never once been inside in 2 years on the station, and found Thesry standing where she usually stood, looking out over the gas giant's slow violet storms, though her long neck was bent at an angle that Mara had learned, over the past 2 weeks of working alongside enough Ithran to notice, meant something closer to exhaustion than composure. The structural review is complete, Thesry said, without turning around. Spine 6 failure was catastrophic but contained. Full station loss was avoided by approximately 40 minutes, according to the engineering team's models. 40 minutes, Miss Voss, is the distance between a station that lost 11 workers and a station that lost 6,000. I know the numbers, Director. I don't think you do. Not fully. I've spent 11 years managing the station on the assumption that competence and short-lived urgency were separate things, that hurry and organization were opposites. She turned, finally, her jaw ridges pale in a way Mara hadn't seen on her before. I was wrong about that. I would like to understand how wrong, if you're willing to tell me. Mara thought about the notebook in her bunk, 400 days once, fewer now, crossed off in neat rows through weeks that had felt, at the time, like nothing more than waiting. She thought about a mess hall mural of a hillside painted by someone she'd never met, and a checklist read aloud inside a dying suit's helmet, and a four-armed friend who had never once, in 2 years, needed to be asked twice for help. It's not really about hurry, she said. It's that when something falls apart, we don't wait to find out whose job it is to fix it. We just start building something that works, out of whatever's closest, with whoever's next to us. It's not bravery. It's just what happens to a species that spent its whole history figuring out how to survive things that were bigger than any one of us. She paused. It doesn't need a company's authorization. It never has. I think that's the part nobody here ever accounted for. Thesry was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, the lease for Spine 6 full structural replacement has been approved. Effective immediately. And the human contract block's emergency response protocols are being rewritten, based on a plan I'm told was already drafted, in detail, by workers who had no authority to draft it. We didn't ask permission, Mara said. We didn't think we'd get it in time. No, Thesry agreed, something in her voice that might, in a longer-lived species, have been called humility. You wouldn't have. She offered Mara a revised contract that afternoon, not release from the remaining days, which Mara had half expected and would have refused on principle, but a formal position, station-wide emergency coordination, built around the plans she and Kellen had drawn up in secret over a folding table 3 weeks before the world underneath them had come apart. Mara took 2 days to think about it, not because she doubted the offer, but because she had learned, the hard way, that decisions made too quickly on a station like this one had a way of costing more than anyone expected. She said yes on the 3rd day. Not because it erased the 400 days still left on her original contract, and not because Director Thesry's newfound respect changed the shape of what Halvorn Reach actually was, an old, patched-together station held up by more goodwill than good funding, the way most working places in this galaxy were. She said yes because somewhere in the 11 days since the collapse, she had stopped thinking of her time here as something to be merely endured, and started thinking of it as something worth building, alongside people who had, when it mattered most, chosen to build it with her. That night, for the first time in weeks, The station was quiet. No groaning traveled through the deck plates when the shift lamps dimmed. Mara lay in her bunk and listened to the ordinary hum of a station simply doing its work, and somewhere down the corridor she could hear Kellen's voice through a thin wall, arguing cheerfully with someone about a mechanical part, the same argument he seemed to have with somebody every week of his life. She thought about the report she'd found in an archive nobody wanted her in, and the door with no working lock, and the chair she'd decided, quietly, to keep nearby, just in case. She had not known, when she made that decision, that it would be the thing standing between an ordinary Tuesday and a catastrophe. She understood now that it hadn't needed to be extraordinary to matter. It had only needed to be there, ready, built by hands that had never once waited to be told it was their job. Somewhere above her, Director Thessery stood again at her viewport, watching the slow violet lightning crawl across the storm bands of a gas giant she had watched for 11 years without ever fully understanding what was holding the station beneath her together. She understood it a little better now. Not the engineering. The rest of it. She would carry that understanding into every report she filed for the remainder of her posting, and it would follow her, eventually, into rooms far from Halvorn reach, into conversations with other administrators who still priced humans the way she once had, a known variable, accounted for, filed away. She would tell them, when they asked, that they had not yet found the edge of that variable, because she hadn't either, not really, not even after the night she'd watched 6,000 lives hold themselves together in the dark with nothing but trust and a hand-drawn plan. She would tell them it was not a thing you could measure until it was tested, and that by the time it was tested, it was usually too late to change your mind about what you'd find. A month after the collapse, the mess hall mural was repainted, the original having been damaged when a support strut cracked the bulkhead behind it. Whoever had painted the green hillside years before was long gone, rotated home on a contract Mara had never known the details of, so the work fell to whoever wanted to pick up a brush. In the end, it was Pete who did most of it, with Dessa adding details along one edge that nobody had asked for and everybody agreed improved it, a line of low, rounded hills from a Kethran homeworld Mara had never seen, set against the same green slope that had watched over 3 generations of tired workers eating the same thin stew. Mara stood in front of it the evening it was finished, Kellen beside her with all 4 hands wrapped around a mug of something that was technically coffee, and neither of them said very much, because there wasn't a great deal left to say that the mural didn't already say better. 2 hillsides from 2 worlds neither of them would ever stand on again anytime soon, painted side by people who had never asked each other's permission to belong in the same picture. 400 days, Kellen said eventually, nodding at the notebook she still carried, though the number in it now read considerably lower. You still counting? Habit, Mara admitted. Doesn't mean the same thing it used to. No, he agreed. I don't imagine it does. Outside the hull, the gas giant turned on, indifferent and patient, the same slow violet storms rolling through its bands as they had rolled for longer than either species had existed to watch them. Halvorn Reach turned with it, scarred and re-welded and, for the first time in 11 years, genuinely repaired rather than merely patched, carrying 6,000 lives through the dark in a structure that had very nearly not survived to carry anyone at all, and that had, in the end, been saved not by anything the company had built into it, but by what its workers had built into each other, quietly, long before anyone in authority thought to ask.